Welcome back to part two of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. If it is the final Thursday of the month, you know what it is. It is time for Race Class with Jonathan Feingold, a professor of law at Boston University Law School. We begin our show every month by reminding you that legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In our effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and myself, Arnie Arnesen, are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course/conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And I think that last line is so important, that we approach these issues through a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And if I think about higher education, especially, or frankly, public education, it is a place where we're allowed to be curious, okay? In fact, that kind of curiosity should be encouraged, which I have to tell you, Jonathan, is why I so hate the concept of vouchers and charter schools and, education freedom accounts and homeschooling, because what they lack is that they will, in fact, sometimes restrict that concept of curiosity. And they will encourage, unfortunately, fear and anxiety, because I see the idea of vouchers as a return to segregation. I see vouchers as a way to sort of minimize what our children are able to learn and who they're able to learn from, and the expansive knowledge that they really need to go into the future. So to a large extent, Race Class is so important, and it should be almost a concept that we see in every school in America. So let me welcome you to your program and start by saying this was your pitch to me. Pro-Israel Jewish organizations are amplifying anti-Semitism on campus. Pro-Israel Jewish organizations are amplifying anti-Semitism on campus. I read that headline. I'm like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? But of course, I kind of know what you're talking about, and I think this next half hour will explain it. But as we look at the whole situation going on in Gaza, as we look at the inhumanity, as we look at the horrific events of Hamas, as we look at both, I think, in a lot of ways, Bibi and Hamas need each other, because both of them so not want a two-state solution. Both of them want to obliterate the other, okay? And they need each other. It's almost like it's this incredibly toxic relationship. But every time you raise any criticism about the leadership of Israel, you are accused of being anti-Semitic, Jonathan, and you know that, and that's in part why we're having this conversation. So let me tell you what I say over and over again, and what it is not uncommon for me to post on my Facebook page over and over again. And this is what I write. Israel is not a synagogue. Israel is a nation. Let me repeat. Israel is not a synagogue. Israel is a nation. And so therefore, when I am critical of Israel, I am not critical of Judaism. When I am critical of Donald Trump's administration, the potential of what might happen after 2024, it is not that I don't love America, but I am horrified by the actions of the leadership. So again, I think in some ways that's almost like the wallpaper in the background as we begin our conversation. So let me welcome you back to the program and explain to my audience why you've decided to take up this topic under the rubric of Race Class, because I think it's important for us to connect these dots. So thank you.
Thanks, Arnie. It's very nice to be here. I just had some cold brew and I'm feeling a little amped up. And so we might get a little amped today.
Okay.
Though maybe not. It's a very dreary day in Boston and I was up too late last night. So on vouchers, so in a sense, it's all connected. So
Yes.
vouchers, um, whatever New Hampshire calls their freedom school accounts. Part of it is
Yes.
this ideological project to counter very modest inclusionary efforts that exist in at least some public education spaces, but it's also a massive grift. So there's a recognition that there's billions of dollars, 6 or 7 billions of dollars in our public education system, and there are moneyed interests who want that money. And there's an ongoing strategy to get at that money. And so I think it's important to appreciate the economic incentives that are driving efforts to funnel public money, our tax dollars, into the hands of folks who want to privatize public education, not just for some ideological purpose, but because they want that cash.
Mhm.
Um, but so you asked this question, so I will spend a couple minutes framing our conversation today before getting into the specifics of it. And I know that we are not going to have enough time to really get into a lot of what I want to talk about, which is okay. We can continue this conversation another time. You um, sort of shared this like pitch that I shared with you, and I've since tweaked it. So now it reads pro-Israel Jewish organizations manufacture the new anti-Semitism. And part of the reason, and so you ask, well, why is race class, this program, this podcast that we call Race Class, engaging questions about anti-Semitism? And one answer could be that, especially if you're someone who is familiar with the work of Eric Ward, you appreciate the deep interconnection between anti-Semitism and white nationalism, and
Mm.
appreciate how anti-Semitism and a lot of the ideology, sort of the old school anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, fuel and animate white nationalist movements in different respects. And so you really cannot be a fully well-rounded anti-racist scholar or scholar of racism, anti-black racism, unless you really understand how anti-Semitism fuels ideologically and otherwise white nationalist movements. That's one piece of it. That's less sort of our immediate focus today. Another is sort of ask the question, so why me? Why would I be having this conversation? And I'm asking that not as a question of sort of personal identity or experience. I am Jewish American, as you know, and and someone who'd be racialized as white. But I am not a Middle East expert, and our conversation right now is not about Middle East policy per se. But what I am is someone who has read a lot about the process of racialization
Mhm.
and how race functions and travels and operates domestically, and how particular identities can be flattened and essentialized in ways that um, lead to all sorts of uh, bad outcomes, you could say. And so,
Okay.
um, part of my question personally recently has been how can I draw on the analytical resources that I have cultivated through years of hard work and reading a lot and getting things wrong and understanding things more to try to understand a ongoing phenomenon that is happening right now in the United States that has to do with a particular manifestation of what I think of as a sort of new anti-Semitism and the complicity that I see in pro, like ostensibly pro-Israel as currently constituted Jewish organizations or right-wing Jewish organizations, this relationship. And so it's a question of how can someone who's a race scholar uh, begin to understand and parse through and unpack what's happening right now in this moment. And so today's race class is going to be a little bit different than some past episodes where normally the episode is a fully formed thought. This is meant to be sort of a look inside the process where I am going to share how I'm currently in a dynamic, far from static way, trying to draw on um, frameworks and concepts that I am familiar with to understand, diagnose, and parse through something that's happening in real time. And so I'm being very clear. I do not have, like, I have sort of hypothesis slash theory and instincts and tools, but this is not the end of any sort of conversation. And so that is the backdrop. And let me share a little bit more where this is coming from. For the past months now, I have received a steady trickle of emails, of texts from family and friends who are Jewish, that link to or sort of point to articles, often in our mainstream press, that make two claims. The first is this claim that anti-Semitism is on the rise, which is a descriptive claim, sort of claim that the world as it is. The second is the claim that progressives are to blame, which is you can think of it as a causal claim, as to sort of explaining why anti-Semitism is on the rise. I am deeply skeptical about both claims, particularly when they're paired in this way. And here's why I'm so skeptical. And we've talked about this, many of the individuals who are leveraging their bully pulpit to proclaim that anti-Semitism is on the rise are folks like Elise Stefanik and Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's her name, Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Yeah,
Never actually
it's
said it out
MTG.
loud.
Yes.
I've never said it out loud.
I've said it
sounded
too
weird
often.
in my
Go
head.
on.
So
Yep.
they're the ones, they are among the folks who are raising, quote unquote, like alarm bells about anti-Semitism, yet they are deeply embedded in Christian nationalist projects right now, very comfortable with great replacement theory, with all sorts of manifestos that are openly anti-Semitic in the old school ways. And so I think it'd be weird not to be deeply suspicious when they are on the front lines making that claim. And the second is this notion that anti-Semitism is rising and progressives are to blame, DEI to blame. That is verbatim what folks like Chris Rufo are marshaling.
Articulate.
And
yeah.
So you should know, Arnie, that I was talking with a colleague recently as to why I'm so skeptical and saying how I'm concerned when mainstream media, when folks sort of in the middle, on the left, concede any ground that sort of progressives are to blame for anti-Semitism, because it is literally reproducing the talking points of right-wing entities like Heritage Foundation, who we know just like met with Viktor Orban. But their response was, John, I like you, but you sound like a conspiracy theorist. And I was caught off guard in part because all I'm doing is quoting folks like Christopher Rufo, who have been open for years now that what they are attempting to do through a concerted, well-funded, highly infrastructure communications campaign is stigmatize everything that is inclusionary, progressive, etc. And so I am just going to quote Rufo a few times now so that anyone who is listening is like, John is being conspiratorial. It's like, no, I'm simply quoting Rufo.
Take them at their word. Take them at their word is what you're suggesting. All right, what does Chris say?
A Politico article from January 3rd that was discussing Rufo's complicity in a campaign to remove Claudine Gay from Harvard. So question to Rufo. Do you think the playbook works on any issue, or do you think that the Israel-Palestine issue is unique insofar as it's already dividing elite liberal organizations? Rufo's response. I've run the same playbook on critical race theory, on gender ideology, on DEI bureaucracy. For the time being, given the structure of our institutions, it's a universal strategy that can be applied by the right to most issues. I think we've demonstrated that it can be successful. His strategy is the smear campaigns that he has uh, openly and sort of celebrated the success of against stuff like quote unquote CRT. Tweet from Rufo from March 21st. We are driving the narrative yet again. Until leadership institutes reforms, people will think when people think quote unquote Harvard, they will think DEI, plagiarism, anti-Semitism, and scandal. Someone who is celebrating a successful smear campaign. Harvard Crimson article from February 24th. And there's like a little sort of framing, then goes into the quote. As criticism of Harvard's handling of campus anti-Semitism swelled and arguments connecting anti-Semitism to DEI gained purchase, Rufo and other conservative activists saw a chance to pounce. Rather than just criticize DEI for failing to properly support Jewish students, they could tear down DEI completely. And then the quote from Rufo, it provided this political opportunity for those of us who have been writing and speaking about this for years, this being sort of the anti-racism faction, to start mobilizing the new constituency against some of these ideologies. And so this is just all to say, when someone sends me an article that makes the claim either that anti-Semitism is spiking or that progressives are to blame, I react reflexively because I see a successful right-wing communications campaign that has infiltrated popular discourse, in part because many of the people who now instinctively sort of understand anti-Semitism to be rising or associate it somewhat with progressives in some amorphous or not way, they have no relationship to the right-wing propaganda. But that's just signaling the effectiveness of the right-wing propaganda. But sorry, go ahead, Arnie.
I just want to remind you use the term Chris Rufo like everybody. I mean, Chris Rufo doesn't have the same notoriety as Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So I just want to remind everyone a little bit about Chris Rufo, because I want people to understand that when you use his name, this is who you are referring to. He is an American conservative activist. The reason you know the name Chris Rufo is because we've been spending a lot of time in Florida, okay, with Ron DeSantis. Remember his war on woke? Well, it turns out that he appointed Chris Rufo to be a board member at the college he was dismantling, known as New College. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. His basic involvement with the Republican Party is his efforts to destroy and restrict critical race theory. When he realized that that was a little bit difficult because it was only taught in a couple of law schools around the country, they decided to morph into what? Into a war against diversity, equity, and inclusion. He has a bully pulpit. He gets repeated a lot. And as you describe, what he has done so successfully is if anyone raises any questions about the humanitarian horror going on in Gaza, if they suggest that Bibi Netanyahu is not leading appropriately and he himself is corrupt and is using this as a way to basically not have to address his sort of criminal background, it is now that you are not just being concerned about the Palestinian issue, you are now expressing an anti-Semitism position. They have now conflated the two, so you can't even speak about Gaza. You can't even mention anything without being assumed to then all of a sudden have sold yourself out and you are clearly an anti-Semite. And I think that is what is so horrific, is that he's been so successful at connecting the dots. And frankly, let's be honest, AIPAC has helped, ADL has helped, and this is making it so difficult for people on college campuses to know what actually is real and what is Memorex.
And I hope no one has left the conversation, because I'm going to take a maybe unpredictable turn. So there is a real risk in that accompanies the reflex that I always feel. The reflex to discount the claim, for instance, that anti-Semitism is spiking, because that claim parallels what I think appropriately identify as part of a broader right-wing communications campaign. And the risk is that if one reflexively dismisses claims of anti-Semitism or concerns about anti-Semitism because they overlap with right-wing propaganda, you are prone to make both an analytical mistake and a
Okay.
political mistake. The
Yes.
analytical mistake is that overlap between a communications campaign and claims or concerns does not mean that there are not real legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism on campus and elsewhere, nor that they are necessarily on the rise. And one of the reasons why this sort of propaganda is so effective is because anti-Semitism is always a serious concern. And there's
Right.
degrees to which that it is embedded within American society and globally. And so um, for to simply dismiss can lead to a misdiagnosis, even if
Right.
the reflex is inappropriate in some ways. And it can also alienate individuals who recognize and are most vigilant to anti-Semitism. I don't mean the sort of conflated anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but acts of openly anti-Jewish bias or the same sort of um, pervasive conspiratorial ideas that are always sort of floating around American society. And I want to make a little sort of analogy here um, that my colleague Vinay Harpalani, who is a sort of leading scholar on affirmative action in Asian Americans in the United States, often helps to remind me. So recent attacks on affirmative action, including the litigation against Harvard, you had right-wing individuals and networks who proffered this story that Harvard was discriminating against Asian Americans um, in order to malign affirmative action. It was very clear that Ed Blum centered Asian American identity specifically to stigmatize racial inclusion. Now, that led many civil rights groups to just simply reject the claim that Asian Americans were confronting bias at Harvard or otherwise. Now, that makes sense to the extent that you are recognizing Ed Blum, Pacific Legal, and these other groups are engaged in a sort of instrumentally leveraging Asian American identity for ulterior purposes. But it leads to analytical mistake, or at least to an analytical mistake, because there was evidence of anti-Asian bias.
Yes. Yes,
It
I
was
agree.
not the product of affirmative action, and we know that in
Right.
part because wealthy white students tended to benefit, and arguably was not legally cognizable. But there is analytically, we should be concerned if we are simply dismissing the claim or concerns about anti-Asian bias because uh, folks sort of on the other side are trying to manipulating that for different ends. But it also
So, but what they're using, Jonathan, what they're saying is that there is a kernel of truth in what they're saying. They're then taking that kernel of truth and then they're directing it for their agenda. They're not, I mean, it's not that they're not acknowledging what you and I both just said. You know, there is Asian bias, but it wasn't caused by affirmative action. But if there is Asian bias, and then you can use that to sort of divide and conquer, that's why they're so successful. And I just want to point out the idea of anti-Semitism. I ran for Congress in 1996, long before we had the issues going on right now. And guess what? Everyone thought I was a Jew. And I never corrected the record. And a U.S. Senator told me, "Oh, Arnie, why didn't you tell people you weren't Jewish? You might have won the election." That was 1996. All right. So let's talk about anti-Semitism. It has been around for a long time. It isn't something that was just created. It doesn't only have to do with what, you know, you're hearing now with the arguments about what's going on between Gaza, Hamas, and Bibi Netanyahu. That was 1996. I get it. I've lived it, Jonathan. I've lived it. So I think, again, we can't discount what is true. What we can do is see how it's being distorted and how it's dragging us in a direction that not only doesn't address the problem, frankly, makes the situation a million times worse.
and so this is race class. We really it is
Yeah.
important to me that we are as precise as possible. And I'm not saying that you're not being, but and I'm also being mindful um, of time. Uh, anti-Semitism obviously is a term that can mean a lot of different things. And so I want to so I want to avoid the risk that I just
Yeah.
identified, the risk of sort of the analytical mistake or the
Yep.
political mistake of just alienating um, friends and allies and family because of an like arguably an over reaction or reflex to discount because that some of the proponents of it are doing so in bad faith. And so I'm going to be really precise right now. And I want to I'm going to offer a descriptive claim that I think is probably accurate. Students on college campuses whose dress or clothing signals Jewish identity, I think that right now they're more likely to encounter hostility or negative attitudes
Yes.
or like
Yes, I
suspicion on
agree.
campus. And
I
so like
agree.
an example would be someone who wears like a kippah or like a Star of David, like on a necklace. And these are symbols. This is like dress that is inextricably linked with Jewish identity. And so to be clear, I think that it would be inaccurate to suggest that right now in this moment, individuals who wear that sort of um, anything that signals Jewish identity are likely a little bit more vulnerable to hostility. But now this brings me to the causal question. The question is why? Because it might be that that is true, but then the second question is why is that true? And here's one of the and so this is when I said like I'm like currently trying to think through this dynamic right now. I think one of the driving causes are right-wing provocateurs like the MTGs and certain
Hmm.
pro-Israel groups who have effectively shaped public discourse in a way that has hardened the cognitive association or link between Jewish identity on the one hand and Israel's current military policy on the other. And
Exactly.
and so it's that when someone sees the symbol that is for the person wearing it a reflection of religious or cultural identity, what is experienced, what is perceived is Israel's current atrocious, horrendous, indefensible campaign against Palestinians. And so how do I get there? And so I'm going to sort of unpack it a little bit by turning to Khaled Beydoun, who is a scholar of Islamophobia.
Hmm.
Because if and so this is also where like I'm situating myself how am I trying to make sense of this? Well, I'm turning to frameworks and tools that I'm more familiar with to try to get a sense of what's happening right now. And so in his recent book, American Islamophobia, Professor Beydoun defines Islamophobia as follows. The presumption that Islam is inherently violent, alien, and unassimilable. A
Right.
presumption driven by the belief that expressions of Muslim identity correlate with a propensity for terrorism. And so that is where he is theorizing one of the ways in which Muslim identity is racialized and individuals where whose dress is publicly understood as an expression of Muslim identity are then vulnerable to a sort of anti-Islam sentiment, which is why Sikh Americans who are not Muslim, but are mistaken for Muslim, can be targeted in acts of sort of of Islamophobic acts. And so then it's like, how might we translate that definition or understanding of Islamophobia to the specific example that I'm offering to the claim that students whose dress signals Jewish identity are more likely to encounter hostility, negative attitudes, etc. And so here I'm also, to be really precise, I'm thinking about, so I'm on BU's campus of Orthodox Jewish students who are anti-Zionist.
Yes. People
And
don't
so,
know that.
yeah,
That's
so
right.
Orthodox Jewish students and so based on their dress, they will be um, like clearly Jewish. And then the question is, well, what is one's presumption walking by about their politics because of that? And again, so I do think that there is a degree to which the right-wing Jewish groups have hardened this association between Jewish identity and right-wing Israeli politics. And part of it has occurred, I believe, through groups that, like you mentioned, ADL. I think, among others, sort of both claiming and leveraging an authoritative Jewish perspective. And you can also think like Jewish organizations on campus that tend to have a sort of a monopoly over Jewish life or Jewish space. Engaging in discourse that, again, is linking Jewishness with his Israeli policy, which is it's Israel's assault on Gaza. Part of it is through the rhetorical claim that all anti-Zionism or pro-Palestinian speech, as you said, is per se anti-Semitism. Right. Because if that translates to a claim that criticism of Israel or Israeli leaders is anti-Jewish, then it erodes the space to conceptually distinguish between Jewishness and an openly anti-Palestinian agenda, which does not represent by any means all Jewish people or all Israelis, but seems to be the policy of the current Israeli government. And then you also have one last. No, go ahead, Arnie. We're running out of time.
No. I began the show by saying Israel is not a synagogue. Israel is a nation. And what they are doing here, using the distortion of my concern about the behavior of Bibi Netanyahu, which is not about anti-Semitism, it is not anti-Jewish, it is about bad policy choices that undermine the safety and security of Israel, that frankly undermine now the safety and security of America, is that they're preparing me, if Donald Trump gets elected, not to challenge him. Because if I challenge him, I must hate America. If I challenge him, I must not be, I must not be a patriot. Understand what they're doing. They're connecting these dots so that they strangle me.